Right, shall we kick off? So thank you all very much for coming along. It's clearly a really interesting and an important topic that we're going to be hearing about today. So I'm really pleased that we're joined by Megan Critchley from UNEP WCMC and Rob Field from the RSPB, who are going to tell us about their project looking at the climate change mitigation potential across the ELP projects. So this was work carried out as part of an ELP Advancing and Applying Knowledge grant that began in 2019 and concluded earlier this year. But it's got a great deal of current relevance as we're now just a month away from the COP26 climate change conference. And I think the results of this project really feed into this by demonstrating the carbon benefits that can come from landscape restoration, even where the primary aim of these projects is restoration of biodiversity. So we're really hoping this will be an interactive session with lots of time for questions and discussion. So please do note down any queries or thoughts you have during the session and either pop those into the chat box straight away or hang on to them and stick up your hand at the end. So without further ado, I will hand over to Rob and Megan to tell us about their work.
Right, thanks very much, Nancy, and good morning, everybody. I'm going to take the first stint and then hand over to Megan in a few slides' time. So thanks very much again for the opportunity to talk about this project that, as you can see from the slide, quite a number of people have been involved in, from the partner organisations and also to ELP themselves for their help and facilitation with this work. Can I have the next slide, please, Megan? And that's a gratuitous picture of trees, and then I'll get on to the background. So I think we're all pretty much aware of that amongst other crises at the moment, we have twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss. And these are very much linked to one another. The key role of habitat change and loss in both climate change and biodiversity loss is very important. Land use and land use change is central to both of those. And this also highlights the importance of the so-called nature-based solutions in meeting the Paris goals, because deforestation, land use change have such a key role in both buffering and exacerbating climate change. Reversing those things is clearly going to be very important towards meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement and keeping ourselves below 1.5 degrees by the turn of the century. I just wanted to put in one caveat here that the current work suggests that these so-called nature-based solutions, although they are incredibly important, are only responsible, and I say only, it's still huge, responsible for around 30% of the mitigation required. So they can provide the carbon sinks and the greenhouse gas removal that we need into the future, but they will only have any effect if decarbonisation of the world economy continues at pace or even starts. So these are both vital strands of our path towards keeping climate change to within safe levels. Having said that, we really need to improve our knowledge between the synergies between ecosystem and biodiversity integrity and conservation, particularly relevant in this case of landscape scale restoration and climate change mitigation, to know the scale of those co-benefits, what does work, what doesn't work for either, and any antagonisms between those two things as well. Have the next slide, please, Megan. So just a quick one. This is probably might seem a little bit like semantics, but it's quite important. So we're talking in this talk about nature-based solutions, and in particular nature-based solutions to climate change mitigation. So this work has in the last sort of 4 or 5 years has really continued apace, and looking at the synergies between biodiversity and ecosystems and the climate crisis. And a seminal paper in 2017 by Bronson, Griscom and colleagues estimated that land-based mitigation could contribute approximately a third of climate change mitigation required. But there are a number of different definitions of nature-based solutions, or in particularly Griscom talked about natural climate solutions, that is used to mean different things by different people and also covers different parts of land use and land use change. So what we're talking about here is nature-based solutions to climate change is essentially the protection, restoration or recreation of natural or importantly semi-natural, so that's things on where land is utilised, semi-natural systems which primarily benefit biodiversity but have the important co-benefit of for climate change and for people. So that's moving towards Natalie Seddon's definition of nature-based solutions, which have both biophysical and socio-economic benefits to the world at large, and is less about things that essentially are just using natural processes like photosynthesis on an industrial scale. That is something somewhat different and is likely, when talked about in that way, to be primarily directed at climate change mitigation and may have potentially serious antagonisms to wider biodiversity and socio-economic benefits. So our definition and what we're working to, and I think the important sector here, is nature-based solutions to climate change, where we have a massive synergy between conservation, socio-economic equity, and climate change mitigation. Next slide, please. So the aim of this project was to look at the potential for climate change mitigation within the Endangered Landscape Programme projects. So this is primarily aimed at nature conservation and sustainable land use. What are the climate change mitigation co-benefits of that, of your work? To look at some of the tools that are available that you might use to assess this mitigation and to provide guidance on the tools, both in terms of their applicability to particular landscapes or land management changes, and how to get the best out of those tools. And finally, to use the results of this project to advocate for the linkage between biodiversity protection and restoration, and get that included in NDCs, so nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement, as a mechanism for increasing greenhouse gas removal towards the targets of Paris, the Paris Agreement and UNFCCC at the upcoming COP26 in Glasgow, but also within the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity. So to provide that active link between nature conservation and climate change mitigation. Next slide, please. So now I would like to hand over to Megan, who's going to talk a little bit about, oh, sorry, no, I've gone too soon. Sorry, I'm going to do this bit. So we have within your various sites some knowledge over what changes have happened, what changes are likely to happen, either now or in the future, towards your conservation and your landscape restoration goals. To measure that mitigation, there are a huge range of different tools and approaches available, which even to people who know what they're doing can be quite bewildering. The nice bit about it is that they are all pretty much based on the IPCC guidance. So they're based on the recommendations of the international panels of scientists who have drawn together the links between land use change, and greenhouse gas emissions or removals. But these tools work on a range of spatial scales. Some of them are non-spatial, some of them involve on-site assessments, some of them are done remotely, some of them are done at a very high course level, some can be more accurate. And so we aim to sort of draw out some of the feasible things and to explore their use for this kind of landscape restoration, and then to provide the information to help individual projects now and in the future to use them and get meaningful information out of them. Next slide, please. So at this point, you can see the picture on the right that's just gone a little bit more opaque, is a picture of a small gas chamber being used to measure greenhouse gas flux into and out of a fen. This is the basic scientific data that underlies all these so-called emissions factors that we use to assess the effects of land use and land use change on climate change and its mitigation. And they're arranged generically into 3 tiers. So a tier 1 value, so that's very coarse, globally agreed mean emissions for broad habitat regions, broad habitat types, or very broad management interventions that come about through human intervention in habitats. I should mention here that IPCC is particularly concerned with anthropogenic change. So there is a strong bias within these things towards non-natural or semi-natural habitats. So we're talking about farmland, planted trees, deforestation, those kind of things. So these tier 1 values are very coarse. So you might have a value for farmland for Northwestern Europe, and that's as applicable as it gets. But we all know that there's a huge amount of variation within those things. And these are the default values that are used when making a rough calculation as to the net emissions of a particular land use or land cover type. You go to tier 2 values, these become more refined, so narrowed down to habitat types, soil types, specific biogeographical regions, and specific management interventions. These two are based on the same sort of data, the same sort of raw data collected from actual habitats, but they aggregate them into more specific ways. And both of these have sort of uncertainties, but also error due to non-applicability. So they're not really reflecting the same site of habitat. If you want to get really accurate, you have to go to the individual location and actually measure it. But clearly that's expensive, time consuming, and requires a degree of resourcing and expertise that isn't really the purview of conservationists like yourselves. So generally within these tools to estimate the effects of land use change and landscape scale restoration, we will be using tier 1 values where we don't have any alternative, but prefer to use these tier 2 values, which better represent the sort of changes that we're talking about. Next slide, please. So in making these assessments, the use of these tools, one of the important things is the fact that it's not just a one-off assessment. What we're doing is making comparative assessments based on scenarios of different types of change, thereby reducing the importance of the absolute numbers obtained, but making comparative assessment of the orders of magnitude between different land use types or different scenarios either into the future or measuring past changes. So the typical scenarios that we would use in these kind of things is comparing no change, so the land use that is currently problematic will carry on, so the degradation of the habitat will carry on, as opposed to the situation now where you might implement your landscape scale restoration. So you're comparing, you're viewing your ambition for your landscape in the context of what might occur if you did nothing. So you would have no conservation value, but then you would have a difference in net greenhouse gas or atmospheric implication. Or you could do it looking at if no change had occurred 20 years ago when you started making your interventions, and look at the difference that there would be now if you had done nothing in the past. So we use these two different scenarios to give you a contextual assessment of how your project either will or has affected the climate change mitigation potential of the land that you are working with. Next slide, please. And now I really will hand over to Megan, who's going to talk you a little bit through the tools that we've assessed and their pros and cons. Over to you, Megan.
Thank you, Rob. So I'm going to start by discussing the tools and the methodological approaches that we were using. So two of the tools that we assessed over the course of the project were the EXACT and the Carbon Benefits Project, or CBP tool. So as Rob said, each of these tools follows the IPCC guidance on calculating emissions from the FLU sector under different scenarios. They're both freely available, and they also don't require expert knowledge to use them. So using these tools, we worked with about 9 ELP projects to identify the data requirements for each tool based on the restoration activities that they were undertaking. And where possible, we'd also tried to use both tools for each project to assess their climate change mitigation potential, to sort of demonstrate the differences in their outputs and approaches which projects might want to consider. So the limitations of these tools in the context of assessing landscape restoration projects were also assessed, but where possible, we were working with the tool developers to try and overcome these as well, to sort of provide guidance through the project. So following the project, we developed a general workflow approach, which is outlined based on the processes that we had undertaken with the projects. So this begins with identifying the restoration activities to be assessed, the timeline to assess these activities over, identifying appropriate baseline and project scenarios, as well as which data needs to be collected, and tier 2 emissions factors which could be applied. And then all this data was gathered and input to the most appropriate tool. So I'll now give a brief overview of the two tools, starting with EXACT. So the EXACT tool was developed by the FAO. It's a spreadsheet-based tool, and it allows the user to work through each relevant sheet and input their data, which then automatically updates a result sheet at the end. So the user is able to update emissions factors to tier 2 where they have these available, but otherwise the tool requires the user to input information about the project, such as their location, climate, and soils, which it then uses to further refine the default tier 1 data that it uses. So the tool is also updated quite frequently, so it's recommended to keep checking back on the FAO website to look for a new version if you are going to use it. So the EXACT tool might be preferred by projects for several reasons. So firstly, being a spreadsheet-based tool, this tool is quite intuitive to use. It's very easy to share, and it can be used offline. So that might be particularly helpful if you're working in the field or have a poor internet connection. So the tool also uses land use and management change activities to determine a project's greenhouse gas balance. So therefore you can input direct transitions between land uses and conditions for specific areas of land. And also in the case of forest, it allows you to input tier 2 values for all the carbon pools. So this also includes litter and deadwood in its calculations. The tool also allows the user to define the dominant soil type within their project areas, which are then used to refine calculations. But you can also input specific soil organic carbon stocks for each land cover as you go through the relevant sections in the tool. The tool also includes an inland wetland section. So this includes peatlands, as well as a coastal habitat module, which includes habitats like seagrass, as well as mangroves. So that might be relative to more ELP projects. However, EXACT is more restricted in some of the land cover types that it provides as the default. So if you're using tier 1 values, some of the options for forest types, grassland and agriculture are quite broad and might not be applicable to some of the more kind of local habitats that you typically see in some of the ELP projects. In the case of forests, the tool doesn't allow you to account for harvested wood products without assuming that an area is completely deforested. And then similarly, it doesn't have inputs for things like annual losses of forests through like disease and pests, as well as wind. The calculations in the tool are also all undertaken in hidden sheets. So it's not possible to kind of follow these steps through if you aren't sure where some of the numbers are coming from. So then secondly, we were using the Carbon Benefits Project, or a CBP tool. So this was developed by the Carbon Benefits Consortium, which includes the Colorado State University. So the tool is available online. So it must therefore be accessed through a browser, and you have to set up an account. Similar to EXACT, it takes you through different sections, and you just use the ones which are most appropriate for your project. It also allows you to input tier 2 values where you have them available through their detailed assessment option. But otherwise it defaults to tier 1 values. This tool also includes a spatial element. So as part of the process, it asks the user to upload a shapefile of their project area, or to kind of draw a rough area, which it then uses to refine its calculations. So this tool produces downloadable reports, which come in a PDF format, and they include tables and maps, and they're sort of ready to share with project partners. And you can also download detailed calculation spreadsheets to kind of see how the tool is coming to different numbers. So some of the pros of the tool are that it allows users to input more complex land covers, including things like silvopasture, more complex agricultural systems, and habitats like low density woodlands. So the tool allows users to create their own classes within forestry, grassland, and cropland sections. And I think sometimes they, they take users' inputs and verify them themselves, and then allow these options to become available to other users. So therefore, there's sometimes classes like eucalyptus or olive within the tools, which might be useful for projects as well. So their forestry calculations include inputs for harvested wood products, as well as options for annual losses from fire, pest, disease, and wind. And then the downloadable spreadsheets sort of improve the transparency of the calculations as well. However, unlike EXACT, the tool doesn't allow you to specify direct land use changes which are occurring. So for example, you can't say that 40 hectares of forest is going to be afforested on what was previously grassland. So that might increase some of the uncertainty around the outputs, as well as limit the use of things like land use factors. So the tool does also have a wetland section, but this is currently very simple, and it doesn't allow you to deal with peatlands specifically. So this is something the tool users are also looking to develop and improve in the future. The tool also uses the spatial data. Oh, sorry, the fire alarm's being tested. I don't know if that's really noisy. All right, hopefully it'll stop in a second. I don't know if that's really loud. Usually it's on a Friday.
I can hardly hear it, Megan.
Okay, it's good. I'll carry on then. Thanks. So yeah, the tool uses spatial data to refine soil types based on the FAO Harmonized World Soils database layer. But this is also quite a coarse data set, so it might not be accurate at the project scale. And we also found there was a few smaller bugs and maintenance issues when we were using it. But the project developers were quite quick to act on this where they could, where they would also provide some ways around them. So just to kind of summarize the differences between them. So when assessing most of the projects, both tools could be applied, and which one you choose could just be down to your own user preferences. However, there's a few considerations to take into account. So for example, CBP would often estimate larger emissions reductions from livestock changes or grassland improvements. So this is due to the tool assuming that an immediate change would take place between the baseline and scenarios. But the exact tool allows the user to specify whether a change will be occurring immediately, linearly, or exponentially over the project timeline, and its default option is linear. So in the case of landscape restoration projects, where these kind of occur over longer timeframes, the exact tools options might be more appropriate. The exact tool also includes more carbon pools for forests in their assessment. But as I said before, its calculations are potentially a little more simple, particularly if you're taking things like harvested wood projects or annual losses to pest and disease into account. So also as mentioned previously, the CDP's peatland management can't really account for peatland management, but this might be developed further in the future. And then finally, both tools compare scenarios to estimate a greenhouse gas balance of their project. So they don't really paint a full picture of carbon stock and sequestration of a project area at a given point in time. So for example, EXACT will demonstrate the benefit of re-wetting peatlands or preventing the drainage of peatlands. But if you have an area of peatland in your project area, it won't account for the ongoing sequestration which is happening there, unless its condition is expected to change under one of the scenarios. So it's important to note that both of these tools are constantly evolving, and methodologies for estimating greenhouse gas balances are also being improved over time. So therefore, these limitations might also not always apply. And then neither tool was designed specifically for landscape restoration projects, but this work has shown that they can be applied to these processes and produce quick estimations, which don't require kind of lots of training and expert knowledge as well. So just to go into some of the project outcomes as well, over the course of the project, we worked with about 9 ELP projects and covered a range of activities. So kind of going from forests and grasslands to peatland restoration, as well as looking at things like direct emissions from livestock. So most of the projects involved forestry or grassland improvements, and these were often associated with changing grazing intensity. And although the project was focused on the restoration benefits of the ELP, we did also take some conservation activities into account. So particularly looking at things like avoided emissions from deforestation. Projects also varied in size, so from about 280 hectares in Wales to over 270,000 hectare projects in Portugal, as well as Belarus and Ukraine. So assessments were also retrospective, so looking at what has taken place so far, as well as prospective, so assessing the potential impact of planned restoration activities. Timelines would also vary from about 8 to 40 years as well. So as you can see, large total emissions reductions and CO2 sequestration was estimated by the project. So in particular, peatland rewetting was estimated to be one of the greatest sources of carbon sinks, as well as avoided emissions. So this is particularly driven by the restoration of about 6,000 hectares of peatlands in Polesia. So all projects contributed to the negative carbon balance. There was a small amount of emissions associated with deforestation of plantations, but these are heavily outweighed by other activities and will continue to be dwarfed through time. So potential avoided emissions made a large contribution to the balances, but these are over large areas of forests, and those are likely to store quite a lot of carbon. There's some uncertainty in estimating the area that could have been deforested. And these also represent very kind of short events which release a lot of emissions, whereas carbon accumulation through the restoration activities occur over much longer time periods. So including avoided deforestation, the total benefits across the 9 assessments totaled about 28 million tons of CO2. But even when looking at just restoration, this is still a huge 9.2 million tons of CO2. So it should also be noted that projects were assessed over different timescales, so it might not be directly comparable, and some assessments were prospective, so their actual balances might change a bit over time, depending on which outcomes are achieved. So we'll now go over a few case study examples, and I'll pass back over to Rob.
Thanks, Megan. I'll just go through a couple of projects, and thank you very much for those projects for allowing us to use them as examples of the sort of things that we've assessed. So the first one will be Cairngorms Connect in Scotland, and the proportion of the land that's managed by Wildlands Limited, which is roughly half of the total Cairngorms Connect area. And they're aiming to achieve their conservation goals by reduction deer population by about 95%. So that's a massive reduction in grazing pressure, and a consequent grassland condition improvement over around 1,000 hectares, allowing native forest regeneration over about 2,000 hectares. Plus the restoration of a small amount, let's say small amount, for 450 hectares of blanket bog. And we've assessed these projects that have already occurred between 2000 and 2020 using the exact tool, which is what we'll present here. Next slide, thank you. So you can see that the major contributor across those 20 years is the reduction of the deer population, giving us around nearly 90,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalents over that 20-year period. The other major contributor being reforestation and the grassland improvement, sequestration of soil carbon over those 20 years. Balanced against a small amount of CO2 emitted, around 10,000, nearly 11,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalents across those 20 years. So giving us a total of about 300,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalents that haven't been emitted or have been sequestered over that time period, which equates to nearly 10 tonnes equivalent per hectare over the whole project area in those 20 years. which gives us, in 2019, the European Union assessed the equivalent emissions of a European citizen over a year. It was around 7 tons of CO2 emissions per year. So that gives us the Cairngorms Connect Wildlands work is equivalent to the emissions of a small town of around 45,000 EU citizens. So although these are relatively small numbers in climate change mitigation, they are actually equivalent to quite a lot of people's emissions being balanced by this work. So I think that's quite important to give you a bit of context over that, added to all the great conservation work that's going on. Could I have the next slide, please? So another project and a region that's quite close to my heart, I visited there a number of times, is Palacia, between Belarus and Ukraine. So the whole project area, they're aiming to protect around 270,000 hectares of native forest from deforestation and wildfire, and also including the restoration of drained lowland bog and fen across around 6,000 hectares. And we've assessed the climate change mitigation potential from now to 2040 that was likely to result from the implementation of these measures using the exact tool. So yeah, some very big numbers here. We reckon that over those 20 years, we're going to get about 20 million tonnes of avoided emissions and a small amount of increased sequestration recovered from non-deforested trees. The major players in this will be the reduction in deforestation and fire, but also fairly substantial emissions reductions from reversing the drainage of lowland peatlands, stopping the per hectare very high rates of emission likely from these things. And you can see that's reflected in the per hectare emissions reductions figure there of around 80 tonnes of CO2 equivalents per hectare over 20 years. So that's about 4 tonnes per hectare per year. This is the equivalent of the emissions of a small city of 150,000 people over that time period. So this is quite a major climate change mitigation potential, as well as the fantastic conservation benefits that are likely to be there. And this partly reflects that it's a very big area, but also this reflects the very high carbon storage and sequestration potential of peatlands and forests. And now I'll hand back to Megan to look at one last case study.
Yeah, so lastly, one of the other projects we were looking at was the Fire Brava Reserve. So this is part of the Greater Coa Valley project and covers an area of about 918 hectares in Portugal. So part of their activities between 2000 and 2020, they replaced intensive sheep grazing with cattle and horses, which were grazing at quite low densities in comparison. So by doing that, the natural processes on the grasslands were restored, and it's thought that the sorry, I accidentally moved things around, and that the grassland conditions would have improved. So this area is also home to a habitat known as Montado, which is only kind of found in these areas of Portugal, and I think a bit in Spain as well. So they're characterized by holm and cork oak woodlands at relatively low densities, and are often kind of include grazing as well. So the aim of the project was to increase the biomass of these areas, as they had historically been sort of had wood removed from them as well, and also to extend the extent of Untitled habitats within the project area. So using the exact tool, we estimated that this totaled emissions reductions of about 4,600 tons of CO2 equivalents over the 20 years, or about 5.2 tons of CO2 equivalents per hectare. So the reduction in the sheep and sort of replacement with horses and cattle was one of the main drivers of this, contributing, I think, just over half of the greenhouse gas balance. So about 2,400 tons of CO2 equivalent being reduced by doing so. So this also benefited grassland improvements, which could have sequestered a further 456 equivalents into the soil. And then the improved Montado management might have reduced emissions by about 1,533 tons of CO2 equivalent. Excuse my mouse. And then increasing the area of Montado as well could have sequestered a further 300 tons of CO2 equivalent. So some of this area expanded into what was previously cropland. I think there's a small area, about 1.7 hectares. So this would have reduced crop residues and the associated fertilizer use by about 13 tons as well. And I think this was all equivalent to about 690 EU citizens if we're looking at the 20 years. So there's been quite a few outputs from the projects. So these include individual project reports, which kind of go through in quite a lot of detail the methodology and the approaches that were used, as well as things like the emissions factors which were applied, comparisons between the two tools, and some sort of key messages to take away for each project. These have also been summarized into kind of 2-pager summary reports to make them a bit easier for sharing as well. And the project also produced a detailed guidance document on using the exact and CBP tools, but also kind of including guidance on things like thinking around what scenarios are appropriate, timelines for assessment, that sort of thing. And then an overall project report has also been produced, which sort of ties all of this information together and produces overall statistics for the ELP projects assessed. So these will hopefully be made available on the ELP website soon, as well as partner websites as well. And we'll let you know as soon as you can find these. And then I'll pass back to you, Rob, for the conclusions.
Right, thanks, Megan. So I think the main conclusion from this work is that climate change mitigation is a substantial co-benefit of the conservation-focused restoration projects that you are all undertaking. So not only are we getting some fantastic conservation, but there are co-benefits in terms of substantial climate change mitigation towards the global targets that have been set, and potentially towards the nationally determined contributions of your individual countries. We've shown that these tools can be used to produce estimates across landscape restoration projects, but that they do have limitations and shortcomings, and the choice of your tool is very much dependent on the sort of work that you are doing. And hopefully we have provided guidance to that effect to help your projects and projects in the future to be able to make their own assessments and choose the appropriate tools for the sort of work they're doing to maximise the demonstration of their co-benefits. And this is really helping to improve and demonstrate the understanding of carbon accumulation and greenhouse gas emissions that natural habitats and restoration of natural or semi-natural habitats can bring, and this will help reduce the uncertainty of the tool outputs, particularly working with the tool developers to highlight the missing gaps and help fill them, so that these tools will be more universally applicable. And that's our hope for the future, that these tools will be more appropriate to landscape scale restoration, as well as the sort of things that lead to widespread landscape degradation. These tools are often targeted towards things that are very aimed at producing single benefits from the landscape, particularly agricultural and forestry products. And it would be nice to have tools that enable you to fully assess the actions that you will undertake to reverse those damaging things. And now I'm going to hand back again to Megan to just run through a few of our future steps in this direction, aimed at helping projects maximise their co-benefits and their impact socioeconomically.
Great, thanks. So I think some of the next steps for this sort of work would be continuing to monitor projects' climate change mitigation potential. So particularly those which were more sort of prospective assessments, to increase the accuracy of the results over time as they begin to realise the extent of their restoration activities, and to also keep sort of updating these tools with new data as it becomes available. It would also be interesting to verify these findings on the ground if any projects do start to kind of do their own carbon work, even just to understand the sort of uncertainties and limitations of these tools as well. And then finally, it might be of interest to some projects to use these sorts of tools to estimate what their potential for carbon finance might look like as well, which also leads me then into just a few minutes on a new project that we're starting next year, which is sort of designed as a follow-on from this one, looking at the opportunities and barriers and funding potential of carbon finance for landscape restoration projects like those in the ELP. So just a quick background to the voluntary carbon market. This has been growing in size quite considerably over recent decades. And it's also particularly relevant as the private sector are being pressured to move towards net zero targets as we approach 2030. So in Europe, there's also increasing demand for high quality credits. So those are particularly credits from nature-based solutions projects. And the demand for these might soon outstrip the supply. As their prices associated with MBS projects were also shown to have increased by about 30% in 2019. So ELP projects are therefore really well positioned to benefit from this increased interest in carbon offsetting. And it presents an opportunity to release some extra funding to scale up restoration activities. And although European carbon projects are often considerably smaller than some international or tropical ones, they do sometimes present higher average carbon prices. So I think in 2017, the average for them was about 13 euros a tonne of CO2 equivalents versus about 4.6 euros on the international markets. And within Europe, the voluntary carbon market is evolving with new standards emerging, particularly at the national level. So understanding the options available to ELP projects could better enable them to understand when to engage and how to improve their outcomes. But doing so, there's a few challenges which projects might face. So these include things like monitoring, reporting, and verification costs. These can be quite costly processes with lots for projects to navigate. So including things like on-the-ground measurements, third-party verification, as well as potentially quite high labour costs when completing forms and reports. And so in the case of smaller projects, or those with kind of more low density carbon landscapes, the cost might not outweigh the potential rewards. So it's important for projects to understand these to avoid any pitfalls. So depending on the scheme, projects might also have to market their credits, find buyers, and build trust by demonstrating that their credits are truly additional and high quality. So projects might also want to consider reputational risk as well. So whether they're selling to companies that might be kind of using them to greenwash their activities, or whether they are actually reducing their emissions alongside offsetting those that they can't. But the market offers several opportunities, so particularly to projects like the ELP. So several schemes allow projects to increase the value of their credits by demonstrating co-benefits like biodiversity, conservation, and socioeconomic benefits to local communities. And so this is particularly relevant for projects like the ELP and those which are smaller and might have habitats which are less carbon dense, but really important for biodiversity conservation, though any extra monitoring costs should be considered. And then, as mentioned previously, demand for these credits, and particularly place-based credits. So some companies might be interested in funding European projects, and these are increasing. And there's also potential for MRV costs to be reduced over time. So some methodologies might start to move towards things like remote sensing, which would reduce labor costs. So the project that we're starting next year with RSPB and Fauna and Flora International aims to identify which standards are most relevant to projects like the ELP, what the MRV requirements of them are, how much it costs to engage, and what sort of rewards you could expect to get. And through this project, we hope to develop a tool and decision tree to facilitate projects in understanding these costs and gains, as well as guidance and case studies. So if you do think that you'd be interested in getting involved, have any ideas for what sort of outcomes would be useful to you, or whether you have data that you want to share, then please do get in touch. We'd be really happy to hear from you. And then finally, I'd just like to say a big thank you to ELP for funding this work, as well as to all the projects who've engaged with us. I think I saw a few familiar faces here. It was really great to work with you and to learn more about what your projects are doing. And hopefully all these outputs will be of benefit to you. And then I'd also like to say a thank you to everyone at RSPB, WCMC, and BirdLife who worked on the project. It was a really big team effort, and everyone pitched in, which was really great. And then also to the tool developers for their help and guidance. So we look forward to continuing this work next year on the carbon side, carbon finance side of things as well. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Megan and Rob. That was a really fantastic overview of what's been a really excellent project, and I think really interesting and useful results. And thank you also for sort of doing the introduction to the carbon finance work that's going to follow on as part of another Advancing in Applying Knowledge grant that's getting underway at the start of next year, I think, which Megan will be leading on again. So I wondered, do you want to stop sharing your screen, and I'll encourage people to turn their cameras on if possible, so we can have a bit of a sort of Q&A and discussion. I can see we've got some questions coming in, which is brilliant. So yes, maybe I can see there's a couple from the ELP team, which I think I will yeah, they can have another chance to do it another time. Mark Hancock, do you want to ask your question? It's probably better than me reading it out.
Yes, okay. Can people hear me? Can you hear me, Nancy? Yeah. Yeah, I was curious looking at the Cairngorms Connect figures and then the Policia ones. If I understood correctly, Policia had avoided deforestation in its figures, whereas we didn't. And I was curious how you decide what forests are being avoided, deforested, and over what timescales. I mean, you know, we have protected forests in Scotland, but that's not a given. You know, we have to implement that protection. We have to maintain quality in those protected areas. There's even been a push to weaken levels of protection, and of course we've recently left Europe, which might undermine European protection. So, you know, how do you quantify avoided deforestation, and where forests are reasonably well protected, can you still justifiably claim some credit for the way you contribute to maintaining those legal protections?
I think there's several issues at play here, Mark. One of them is about making an assessment of potential. So in doing a contextualized assessment of potential as an advocacy and intellectual exercise, which is the aim for not including it in Cairngorms Connect, but including it in Palacia, is primarily to do with making conservative estimates of the likelihood, so not overstating your claim. And given that in the UK, over the last 20 years or so, that protection has essentially meant that there is no deforestation going on. And so if you expand your estimates of deforestation into the future, that translates to no deforestation going on. Whereas we know in Palacia that there is a current and historic deforestation rate going on. And so we used that to project that into the future. As if there was no greater protection, that deforestation rate will continue. Whereas the project is aiming to increase protection and therefore reduce deforestation rate to an equivalent of other protected areas in the region. So that's the basis on what we did. So the reason it wasn't included with Cairngorms Connect but was Palacia because of the historic and current rates of deforestation occurring. So it's perfectly reasonable to assume that if nothing was done in Palacia, the current deforestation rate will continue. It's not to say it may well get worse. If you're trying to make these assessments towards claiming money, I suspect that conservatism would have to be even more so. So, yeah, your likelihood of deforestation would have to be extremely well proved in order for you to be able to sell credits based on deforestation that doesn't happen. So whilst I agree with you that there are real risks that forest protection in the UK and in Scotland in particular may not be as good in the future as they have been in the past, I think the relative risk is low compared to regions like Palacia. And that's the reason why. It's partly a cutoff that we've chosen to make to be conservative in stating our case, and partly to try to mirror the likelihood of what you would have to do in order to sell credits.
And please, you were also interested in finding out more about this when we were discussing the project with them. So as Rob said, they're looking to protect a huge area of land. So we use satellite data to kind of estimate deforestation rates, which had been occurring in that area historically, as well as in adjacent protected areas, and sort of assuming that under protection, the rates will become more similar to those in the nearby protected areas. But there are limitations with using the remote sense data. They kind of use more basic descriptions of forest as well. And we also kind of made the assumption that these areas would be deforested and would kind of be left as deforested plantations, but it could be that they'd then be replanted or changed to other habitats, which could then begin to sequester carbon.
Great, thank you. Yeah, no, interesting conversations, which I'm sure will recur in the next project about proving additionality in particular. Did you have a question, Deli?
I wrote a question on the chat, but I can explain briefly because it's continuing with avoided deforestation, but this time on Mediterranean habitat. So you know that in Portugal there are even models of these kind of landscapes that are abandoned when they're even going to burn again. So we know that some landscapes they burn every 10 years or every 12 years. So if you are changing the management and you are taking care, so you're doing rewilding or you are including ecological processes, and you can claim that you are going to probably avoid these forest fires, because every time that you have forest fire, of course, your whole carbon counter goes back to zero. So the question here would be, of course, this is about probabilities. These forests can burn or not. And of course, with our management, we are lowering the probabilities of fire, but we are not putting them to zero because there are several factors. So I didn't see how, and if you were counting on these probabilities of fire forests where you were doing your work, and if this is something that you can take into account somehow.
You go first, Megan.
Yeah, I was going to say the tools do allow you to kind of input fire use on most habitats, and then CBP for forest specifically allows you to put in annual losses. So if you do think you have reasonable estimates for this, you can include them. But they're kind of designed to think around fire more as a management technique rather than things like wildfires. Exact in particular, they don't really kind of estimate it from a wildfire perspective, but the CBP approach of including % annual losses is probably more appropriate in that sense.
Yes, and I agree. Yeah, it is due to probabilities and predicting the future, particularly. All these tools don't take into account changing biophysical processes or due to changing climate. So they are based on changes that and emissions factors that are relevant to the climate as it is now, not to the climate as it may be. You know, changes in CO2 levels, changes in weather patterns, changes in likelihood of combustion and that kind of thing. So with the best will in the world, because that is such a big unknown, there is so much uncertainty at a local level in these climate models. We have to just take a leap of faith and predict this on the basis of this is what would happen if climate change stopped now, which we know isn't going to happen, and we don't know how it's going to develop. So you have to take that on that basis in terms of producing a case for advocacy. So in that case, if there is strong evidence that what you've done is likely to reduce the probability of wildfire, you could probably claim that in an advocacy sense. I suspect if you were doing this in terms of applying a carbon standard for sale of carbon credits, you would probably not claim that. Or if you did, you would have to have a substantial buffer, which is both in a claim buffer in which you would claim less than you actually think is likely. So you'd make a conservative estimate of savings of deforestation, but you would also have a financial buffer. So a certain proportion of the credits you sell, you don't get the money for until you prove those changes at the end of the project period by repeat monitoring. So in that sense, this is an iterative process. So if you're projecting your management changes into the future, you would revisit that every few years and start to build up evidence towards a change or not in that probability of fire based on what's actually happened. So this is an iterative process by necessity, both in terms of the financial instruments, but also in terms of the advocacy. I can't speak, the advocacy.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, interesting and complicated, but yes, good. There are approaches for taking account of these by the sound of it. So Misha's put in a question about assessments in wetland systems. Are you there, Misha? Are you happy to ask it?
Yeah, so hi. Well, my question was more related to, well, the fact that we're not re-wetting the peatlands or wetlands, but rather changing the dynamics. So if you imagine kind of a fixed water reservoir, pool, and then you change it to kind of a more dynamic water level regime, kind of a natural wetland with droughts and floods within the year. So you get, in the end, a lot more dynamic system with very different processes and very various processes of the composition of the organic matter and some of the emissions and the sequestration. And there's still a lot of argument how that affects the balance of the carbon by and large. I mean, can any of these systems actually crack into this issue of making wetlands more dynamic in comparison to kind of artificially managed water reservoir systems? That's one of the questions. Thank you.
Okay, so with peatlands, the emissions factor, I mean, there's a huge a building body of evidence that suggests that the overriding control on emissions in wetlands is the annualized water table level. So even within very natural peatlands, subject to seasonal weather and the like, that water table will vary with depth above or below the surface during the passage of the year, depending on precipitation and temperature and those various things. But we know that it's the mean annual level at which it sits above or below the surface that is the major control over emissions of greenhouse gases, particularly CO2 and methane. So in a sense, because your annual level will reflect the cumulative effect of your dynamic variation, the emissions factors should take that into account. If you just have a wetland where the water stays at the same level all the time, that will have a certain average emissions. If you have one where it's very dynamic, you will have a slightly different average mean annual water table depth, and that will be reflected in the emissions. Clearly, there will be some finer scale variation in emissions to do with microtopography and the rest of it, but this is the limitation of using even a tier 2 effect. If you really wanted to get to the bottom of it, you'd have to measure your own emissions, which is beyond the scope of most people. So I think within this, it should be reflected to a certain degree in the emissions factors we use, because it is based on water table depth. And that's the way the IPCC defaults and stuff. They've got a lot more resolution in those emissions with more recent work. So we know how to take that into account a bit more. But as with all these things, it is a little bit a thumbnail sketch of the real biophysical changes by necessity, because it's a rapid assessment effectively. Did I answer your question?
Well, I tend to think that we can actually, well, might lead to the fact that we'll be showing increasing emissions, because I think if you look at this on the annual basis, what you do, you decrease the water table because they're artificially managed as higher level water reservoirs, and the natural conditions, they would have been drier. They have been drier like half a century ago. And then if we come back to this system, actually lower annual water tables, that might actually suggest that we are increasing or increasing emissions and then actually decreasing the carbon sequestration.
I get that, and you know, wetlands naturally produce methane, which is on the warming side of your balance sheet. But I definitely, within the scope of what you're doing, your prime objective is biodiversity and landscape restoration, not climate mitigation. Whereas your alternative use of that might be total drainage and much higher. So it might still be a positive emission, but it's a smaller positive emission than the alternative land use. And I think that's the important thing. Remember that it might be a bit bad, but it's not as bad as the rest of it. And alongside that, a little bit bad, you get benefits for biodiversity and conservation. I think we should, within this forum, remember that all our prime goal is biodiversity restoration. It's climate change mitigation is a co-benefit of what you're doing.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's something we have to really bear in mind when you start getting sort of into the nitty-gritty of the details of the carbon accounting. Do carry on putting questions in the box if you have one. I see Misha also added a question about natural grazing. Do you want to go for it, Misha?
No. Yeah, that's another probably not easy question, because from recently, while we're publishing a report by Grace Life, large EU project that suggests that natural grazing systems, they improve very much the soil qualities and the structures, and then the soils evidently store more carbon, and depending on the soil type and the habitats where you are, I mean, from the mountain to the wetlands. And can that be taken, because these interventions in most of our areas are quite significant, but we introduce natural grazing systems to really thousands of hectares. And we, in one of our projects, will be looking particularly at the grasslands. But then if you look at at floodplains, for instance, where the whole kind of diversity of habitats and soils is quite rich, I mean, is that somewhere taken into account? At least that would be very, very important, I think, step for looking into a scale of interventions that we do as an organization, I mean, across Europe, by bringing back the natural grazing systems.
That is something that we were looking at for a few of the different projects. So the exact tool, in particular, both of them really, they kind of limit it to, you look at your grasslands and you say whether it's nominal or non-degraded, moderately degraded, severely degraded. And for that, we were kind of talking with projects to understand what the impact of reduced grazing intensity might be. So that was often kind of making a simple assumption that it will go from, for example, moderately degraded to non-degraded, and then you assign carbon stocks to these. So we often use the tier 1 defaults in the tools for these, just because there's not a huge amount of studies we found in lots of different areas. But if you do kind of have data on how these impact the soil organic carbon stocks, you can update them in the tools, but you are kind of restricted to those categories.
Yeah, I would echo what Megan says. I think in some cases these kind of tools are only as good as the extra data and information you can find to substitute in tier 2 estimates for your tier 1 estimates. But I think the likelihood is that what you're saying, there will be a benefit, because your grazing regimes are likely to reduce stocking density, number of animals per hectare. And there is evidence in other parts of the world that this does exactly as you say it does. And it increases your soil carbon sequestration, as well as reduced methane emissions from your animals. But you're likely only to reflect the animal reduction in these tools. So I think in terms of advocacy, you've got a strong position to say that the estimates made with these tools are likely to be an underestimate of the actual benefit. With that knowledge, I mean, it's certainly the case in the UK that even our coarse estimates of soil carbon by soil type are better under semi-natural habitats than they are under what we would call improved pasture. So I think you would probably have to rely on a narrative to get that, or tier 2, tier 3 work done by local academics to give you actual proof of that. And I would encourage you to see if you can find some scientists to come and measure it for you, and then you don't need the tool. You've got the proof.
Well, actually, leading on from that, Rob, very nicely, I see we've got Oleg, who also works on the same project in the Danube Delta with Misha, who's actually just starting another Advancing and Applying Knowledge grant, actually doing some sort of carbon assessments in the field. And I wondered, Oleg, if you wanted to just give a brief introduction to the work you're going to be doing, because I think it's really relevant to all these conversations, and it would be really nice for the rest of the projects to know what you're working on. Is that okay, Oleg? I know I've put you on the spot a little bit.
Yeah, hello everybody. Yeah, first of all, I would like to say thank you to Rob and Megan, because this project and the results is very interesting for us, because they are in the start of the project assessing carbon sequestration and storage by dry grasslands. So they are also looking at how would say at the experience, because this is this assessment will be quite new for the area. Before it was only experience in Ascania Nova Biosphere Reserve. This is the biggest step Biosphere Reserve in Ukraine, and not only in Ukraine. I think this is the first, the biggest part of the steppe ecosystem in Europe, and in the project the will work based on two preserved steppe, biggest preserved steppe ecosystem in Ukraine. This is Ascania Nova and Tarutina steppe, and the idea is to assess the carbon sequestration and storage in for the how would say, for the in different type of utilization of the land, from really preserved natural steppe ecosystems, steppe dry grasslands, up to croplands and arable lands, and besides this different type of grazing impact, let's say. And we will do it maybe first time for Ukraine, and at the same time they are looking for this project because of actually they would like to have more evidence for steppe or dry grassland restoration in Ukraine. They have quite big potential. At the same time, the size of arable lands increasing in the country because of like a blooming of agricultural activity. Agriculture is one of the most important economic activities for Ukraine for the moment. And they really would like to provide good answers based on our study, and I hope your experience will be very useful for us, and we will be in contact.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks. That sounds really interesting. I was just typing away there a message to you, but maybe we should take this offline. I'm very interested in this work. I'm trying to get something similar going in Western Kazakhstan on very similar steppe under probably very similar threat. So looking at the effects of variations in grazing regime, and indeed, as you say, land use change to arable and stuff. Maybe we should talk about this some more as well. That would be cool.
Yeah, definitely. And it would also be great to discuss in the terms of the carbon finance one as well, if that's something that you're interested in. I'm sure we can discuss more going further.
Brilliant. Really nice to see these synergies between the projects. I was just wondering, I'm going to be cheeky and ask a question myself, but I know we can see we've got a couple of people from the Marine Coastal Project in Turkey. I know, I don't think that was included in the final calculations for various reasons, but I wondered if you could just briefly talk about the applicability of these tools to marine restoration projects.
Yeah, so I think we did discuss the Grakova Bay project with some of us working on it, and within unit WCMC, I think a few people are working on it. I don't think we were able to get data on the project kind of expected outcomes and stuff in time, but we did review the tools just to look at what sort of data would be required from them and whether they would actually be applicable to them. So in their case, it would only be possible to use the exact tool, as CBP doesn't have any kind of marine or coastal modules, whereas that one does allow you to look at things like seagrass specifically, so areas that might be removed, or looking at restoration as well. But it would just be sort of applying emissions factors to estimate carbon sequestration on an annual basis. But that tool does also provide some inputs for things like fisheries and aquaculture. So if those are relevant to the habitats as well, it's possible to kind of understand their impacts on the greenhouse gas balance too.
Yes, so yeah, so that, yeah, you can look at, as well as the seagrass, so you would just look at change in area, would you, of that, but you can look at, say, reduce fishing pressure or reduce dredging. There are some estimates for those kind of activities, are there?
Yeah, there are some options, and it includes things like aquaculture if that's happening on site as well. But we didn't have a chance to kind of actually put numbers in and see how these are applied, but they are there, so definitely worth exploring.
Brilliant, thank you. Maybe I'll let some of the other ELP team members have a go. Georgina, did you have a question about policy, was it?
Well, I guess it could be a broader question, really. I guess I was just wondering how you were expecting to communicate findings with this. Gosh, is that my video freezing again? I'm just going to turn my video off because it seems to be struggling with bandwidth. As long as you can hear me. Yeah, I was just wondering what your plans were in terms of communicating this to a wider audience that, you know, you wouldn't kind of necessarily communicate all sort of technical stuff. And particularly, I think Rob mentioned towards the beginning of the presentation that you would be kind of advocating in some way at COP26. I guess I just wondered what you expect that will look like, what kind of audiences are you looking to connect with? And yeah, are you planning to reach policymakers, the public, other practitioners, and what will that kind of wider communication look like?
I think in relation to COP and CBD, this is towards at the moment policymakers and perhaps national decision makers. Really, this would be primarily drawing the link between biodiversity conservation and or the role of nature-based solutions in climate change mitigation, but also using that to say this isn't the entire answer. You can't rely on offsetting to reach your national targets, because even if we returned the whole planet to natural vegetation, it would not be enough to get rid of the historical, let alone current emissions. So, you know, this stuff is really important, and it's important not to get it wrong, because if you get it wrong, you will make the biodiversity crisis worse and not solve the climate crisis. And I think that's as important a message as saying biodiversity conservation is important in climate change mitigation, which it is, but the converse is even more important. Don't get it wrong, because if you get it wrong, you will still have two crises that aren't solved. They'll just be worse. In terms of how it's going to look, we're currently working between WCMC, BirdLife and RSPB in honing our message and our advocacy materials towards COP26 at the moment, to be used by our, I think all three of those organisations will have representatives in Glasgow in person, and we are going to arm them with some of the materials that we have, some of the information we've collected from our colleagues here as case studies of how you can tackle both crises by this kind of landscape scale restoration and the potential that it has. So not only do you get some good climate mitigation, it won't solve the entire problem, but you get a load of other benefits as well. You get biodiversity conservation, you get community involvement, engagement, and well-being from it. And I think it's that message that nature-based solutions are not just solutions to climate change, they're solutions to a lot of other societal ills.
Yes, no, it's brilliant timing in terms of producing the results, and yes, it'd be great to get that message coming through loud and clear. We've got a couple of minutes left. I see Jeremy's just put in a question about sort of extending and revisiting the assessment for the landscapes, and that's something I know we've had a conversation about. Do you want to quickly ask your question, Jeremy?
I will try. I've got bad connection here. I'm in Forest Lodge in the middle of Abernethy, so I might be a bit glitchy.
You're all right. Oh.
No, I think that just proved his point.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm very well. All of the other partners, apart from Wildland, have I glitched? Okay. Is it? Is it okay if I just talk? Is that better?
That's better.
Yeah, it's better not to look at me anyway, Rob, I think. Yeah, frustratingly, the only partner in the Cairngorms Connect area who provided the data, despite lots of chasing by Tom, myself and others, was Wildland Limited. So we only have half the story. It's roughly 50% of the project area. And I'm really keen to see if we can get this evaluation done for the whole of the partnership area to tell a much bigger and better story. And I've just put another point in the chat that as of the beginning of this week, we now have a slot in the blue zone in the IUCN pavilion for an hour and a half at COP26. So there's clearly an opportunity to tell a story, not for then, but in the longer term. I'd really like to do a full evaluation. It's just whether for a price there's capacity to do that.
Yeah, I'd say that's definitely worth discussing, and then also hopefully the guidance materials as well that are produced through the project could even be used to kind of expand the assessment which was done, because some of the emissions factors that we sourced for the project might be applicable to the wider areas as well. And I think we would have provided the exact tool to you. Hopefully we can help out a little bit with this as well. Yeah, do get in touch.
That would be great, Megan. I'm going to take your hand off there and definitely follow that up. Thank you.
Yeah, and to say it's something we're thinking about within the ELP as well, with a new set of projects coming on board. It would be really nice to find a way to continue to sort of look at this assessment across all our portfolio of projects and revisit it through time. So I think we should definitely continue that conversation, and yeah, definitely keen to keep Megan and Rob engaged if we possibly can.
I was going to say it would be quite useful that you know, as we follow on through this and the finance project that Megan's leading, that we can try to build a sort of assessment pipeline that means that projects can, you know, even if it's not quite so highly detailed, and that might be the case with Jeremy's extension to the rest of the project, because of we need, in order to do it the same, there's quite a lot of information that you need mapped and management information that might not be readily accessible at the moment, but we could make higher tier assessments of the likelihood of it carrying on across those benefits across the whole Cairngorms Connect area, even if it's just at a sort of lower resolution. So that's two things really, but it would be useful to try and build a simplified pipeline, which is the phrase everybody seems to use at the moment, for a workflow to get people through this and make it more of a sort of mechanics of running the project thing rather than research and exploration work based on the work that has gone on already.
Was there anything you wanted to add, Megan?
No, just to yeah, echo what Rob was saying. It'd be great to see more projects kind of getting involved in this, and yeah, hopefully that's something we can sort of continue with the ELP going forwards.
Fantastic. Oh, well, I think that's a really nice place to finish, really, to think about how this can be continued on into the future and extended. But clearly, really interesting and useful results, lots of good questions, and great that you managed to carry out these calculations across so many projects. But yeah, no, I think the message is this is not the end. This is going to carry on, and there's obviously lots of related work going on. So thank you both so much for giving up your time. Thank you to everybody else for coming along and asking great questions. We have recorded the session, so if you have colleagues, partners, whatever, who are interested but couldn't come along, we will make that available somehow, somewhere. So I think that's it. Thank you all very much, and yeah, see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a nice day.
Thanks
Bye.
Thanks,
for your
everyone.
enthusiasm.